By the summer of 1942, the war in the Pacific had turned into a savage contest of endurance and deception. The United States had recovered from the shock of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Empire, once unstoppable, now faced a determined enemy that was learning fast. But victory was not only decided by fleets or aircraft. It was decided in the mud, in the jungles, and in the quiet hours before dawn, when a soldier's hesitation could mean the difference between survival and slaughter. Guadalcanal became one of those places, a nightmare of heat, disease, and invisible enemies. When U.S. Marines landed in August 1942, they found themselves fighting not just the Japanese army, but an environment that seemed to conspire against them. Visibility was low, communication lines were primitive, the jungle swallowed radio signals, units became separated and confused, and somewhere in the chaos the Japanese found opportunity. Japanese intelligence officers quickly recognized a critical weakness. American troops relied heavily on spoken passwords at night. These challenge and reply systems were designed to identify friend from foe when uniforms and faces could not be trusted. But in the confusion of jungle warfare, where exhaustion dulled the mind and accents blurred through static, it was a fragile defense. Reports began to circulate of Japanese soldiers dressing in captured U.S. gear, carrying American weapons, even mimicking marching patterns. Some could speak basic English enough to trick a sentry long enough to close the distance. Others memorized entire phrases, orders, slang, greetings, learned from listening to prisoners or radio intercepts. The result was terrifying. Night after night, Marines began hearing voices calling out from the trees, familiar words in unfamiliar tones. "Hey buddy, don't shoot." Coming through. Sometimes they were real American patrols. Other times they were not. In one documented incident on Guadalcanal, Japanese soldiers disguised in U.S. uniforms approached a Marine position under cover of darkness. They spoke English fluently enough to convince the guards to lower their rifles. Then when they were close enough, they opened fire. It was an intelligence victory bought with brutal precision, and it left a deep scar on Allied security protocols. Afterward, paranoia spread through the ranks. Sentries began firing on anything that moved without a perfect password. Communication between units suffered. Trust, the most vital currency on the battlefield, began to erode. American commanders realized the danger immediately. They needed a method to distinguish true Americans from imposters, one that could not be copied by rote memorization or mimicry. And so, military linguists and intelligence officers turned to an unexpected ally, the English language itself. The idea was simple but ingenious. Use words that native Japanese speakers would struggle to pronounce naturally, sounds alien to their language structure, filled with difficult consonant clusters or tongue-twisting syllables. Words that couldn't be faked in the dark under pressure. Among these, one would become legend: Lollapalooza. It was an old American slang term meaning something extraordinary. But in this war, it became more than that. It became a verbal weapon, a test that could separate life from death, ally from enemy. By late 1942, the Lollapalooza Test and similar challenge words were being used across several Pacific outposts. It wasn't foolproof, nothing in war ever was, but it worked often enough to save lives. Each night, new passwords were issued. Each morning, new rumors spread of infiltrators caught by a word they could not say. This was not the war of tanks or bombers. This was the silent psychological front, a war fought in whispers, syllables and breath, and as the months passed, both sides would learn that deception could be just as deadly as any bullet. As American forces dug deeper into the Pacific, they began to understand that their fight was as much about intelligence as it was about terrain. The Japanese military, famed for discipline and loyalty, excelled at infiltration. They valued patience, precision, and the art of disguise, skills that thrived in the jungle's confusion. U.S. intelligence soon documented a growing pattern. Japanese scouts slipping through the darkness to cut phone lines, sabotage ammunition dumps, or feed false orders to confuse troops. Every such act relied on a simple weakness: a soldier's instinct to trust a familiar voice. To combat this, the U.S. military redefined its security procedures. Each night before darkness fell, units received two crucial words: a challenge and a reply. A sentry would call out the challenge. If the other man answered correctly, he was friend. If not, he was enemy. At first, these were ordinary words: apple, thunder, victory. But intelligence officers soon realized the enemy could easily mimic them. Captured documents from Japanese units revealed handwritten lists of common American phrases and passwords, memorized phonetically. It was then that linguists from the U.S. Army Signal Corps and intelligence units proposed a radical shift. They began choosing words that exposed the limits of a Japanese speaker's tongue. Japanese phonetics, though rich and rhythmic, lacked certain consonant blends found in English. Sounds like L, R, T, and Z were difficult to differentiate or pronounce quickly under stress. The idea was to select words where these sounds occurred in complex combinations, something impossible to fake without natural fluency. One officer described the test in a field manual draft. The purpose is not only to identify the tongue, but to identify the rhythm of the man behind it. Thus came words like Lollapalooza, rhubarb, bumblebee, and Saskatchewan. Each was chosen for its linguistic cruelty, a kind of verbal tripwire hidden in plain sound. Soldiers found it almost humorous at first. The notion that a word could save lives felt absurd, but after the first few successful captures, no one laughed again. A typical exchange went like this. A patrol returns after dusk, tired and muddy. A sentry spots movement. "Password," he shouts. The approaching men reply, "Friendlies." The sentry's heart races. He gives the challenge, Lollapalooza. There's a pause. Then a stutter, a mispronounced Rora Baruza. In that instant, the jungle explodes in gunfire. Stories like these circulated through every outpost. Some exaggerated, others grimly true, but all carried the same lesson. Vigilance had become survival. By late 1943, this linguistic warfare extended beyond passwords. Code talkers, Navajo, Comanche, and other Native American radio operators became vital assets. Their complex languages baffled Japanese cryptographers. Meanwhile, psychological operations units experimented with mimicking Japanese commands to lure enemy soldiers into traps, turning the art of deception back upon its masters. The Lollapalooza incident, though one of many, symbolized the turning tide. It revealed not only American adaptability, but also how language, something as intangible as sound, could shape life or death outcomes. Historians later noted that this strategy did more than catch infiltrators. It restored morale. For the first time in months, American troops felt they had a dependable safeguard against the faceless enemy in the night. They began trusting their procedures, their comrades, and their discipline again. In a war that thrived on chaos, that trust mattered. It was the difference between panic and precision, between pulling the trigger too late or too soon. And yet, beneath that fragile calm, the war's psychological cost deepened. Every rustle in the leaves could be an enemy voice. Every friendly call might be a trap. The Pacific Theater was no longer just a battlefield. It was a labyrinth of deception. And as new campaigns unfolded across the Solomon Islands, New Guinea, and the Philippines, both sides would push the boundaries of what intelligence and language could do in war. The question was no longer who had more guns or ships. It was who could think faster, lie better, and speak more convincingly in the dark. War was not only fought with weapons, it was fought with nerves, and the human mind had limits. For the men on Guadalcanal, New Guinea, and Bougainville, every night was a test of sanity. Rain hammered down. Mosquitoes swarmed. The jungle smelled of rot and cordite. Sleep was a luxury. Trust was a gamble. The fear of infiltration haunted every campfire. A rustle outside the perimeter, a whisper in the dark. It could be a fellow Marine returning from patrol, or it could be death wearing a borrowed uniform. Sentries stood with fingers tight on triggers, knowing one wrong judgment could mean disaster. One veteran later recalled, "We didn't fear the enemy we could see. We feared the ones who could sound like us." This was the essence of the Lollapalooza test. It was more than a password. It was a psychological lifeline. A sentry who demanded it was not just following orders. He was asserting control over an invisible chaos. The ability to challenge and confirm meant one could still tell order from madness, friend from ghost, but it came at a cost. Paranoia seeped through the ranks. Men shot at shadows, at returning scouts who hesitated half a second too long. Friendlies were lost to nervous fire. and guilt became another kind of shrapnel embedded in their minds. The human toll of this linguistic warfare was profound. Each word carried not only tactical weight but moral weight, because in war hesitation could be fatal, and certainty could be mistaken. To understand why Lollapalooza worked, one must understand the boundaries of the Japanese language itself. Japanese phonology is syllabic. Each consonant sound, except N, is followed by a vowel, creating rhythmic and evenly spaced syllables. Ka, ki, ku, ke, ko. English, by contrast, is full of consonant clusters, SPL, star, pilals. These were alien to the Japanese tongue, both in shape and in rhythm. The word Lollapalooza embodied every sound that would trip a native Japanese speaker. The L, absent from Japanese phonetics, often replaced with R. The internal double L that required tongue placement unfamiliar to East Asian speakers. The rolling Z, difficult to voice distinctly under pressure. In short, it was a trap set in sound. To an American, the word was whimsical. To a Japanese infiltrator, it was a linguistic minefield. Military linguists knew this. They tested potential challenge words among Japanese-American interpreters, studying which sounds caused the most hesitation. It wasn't about mockery, it was cold pragmatism. A second of stammering could mean the difference between a successful infiltration and a fatal giveaway. In one U.S. Naval Intelligence memo from 1943, an officer wrote, "Challenge words should not merely test comprehension, they should test instinct. No man can learn instinct overnight." That was the genius behind Lollapalooza. Even a fluent Japanese speaker could study English grammar and vocabulary, but under the stress of darkness, rain, and a rifle pointed at him, his accent, rhythm, or hesitation would betray him. Language became a battlefield of its own, invisible, intimate, and merciless. Words, once tools of culture and poetry, were now used as sentinels of death. For Japanese forces, infiltration was more than deception. It was strategy. They had learned from earlier campaigns in China and Southeast Asia that psychological warfare could destabilize even the strongest positions. A single disguised scout could sow panic far greater than an artillery shell. Japanese infiltrators were often elite soldiers, selected for intelligence, calmness, and linguistic ability. Some were trained by naval intelligence schools that taught them basic English commands and American slang. Others learned from captured manuals or from observation on the battlefield. The goal was not always to kill. Sometimes it was to listen, to slip into an American perimeter and overhear orders, to identify officers, to destroy communication wires before a dawn assault. These infiltrators were armed lightly, knives, grenades, and courage bordering on fatalism. Their survival rate was minimal, but their psychological effect was immense. Each successful infiltration made American troops more trigger-happy, more suspicious. The enemy's greatest victory was not in taking lives but in eroding trust. To counter this, American commanders adapted. Perimeters were tightened. Patrols were restructured. Passwords changed nightly, and linguistic traps became standard procedure. By 1943, the infiltration advantage had begun to fade. What was once a potent Japanese tactic became increasingly suicidal. The Lollapalooza Test and its counterparts turned the tide of deception against its creators. Still, both sides respected the cunning behind it. War had become a battle of intelligence, a contest of observation and anticipation. And in that shadowed contest, one could not afford to speak the wrong word. War distorts morality until right and wrong blur beneath necessity. For the men who stood watch under a canopy of rain and fear, the act of killing was often decided by a sound, a syllable, a stumble, a breath. There was no room for hesitation, no luxury of doubt. Many soldiers later spoke of the guilt that followed. They were trained to shoot if a challenge word was mispronounced. No questions, no mercy. But language, like humanity, is imperfect. Sometimes a fellow Marine mumbled the word through exhaustion or fear, his tongue thick from dehydration or malaria. And sometimes that moment's hesitation cost him his life. The Lollapalooza Test, for all its brilliance, carried a haunting truth. It measured not only a man's origin but his survival under pressure. It was a moral gamble disguised as a tactical safeguard. Historians have debated the ethics of linguistic warfare. using speech as a tool of death. But on the battlefield, ethics were a distant echo. War demanded instant judgment, and judgment demanded simplification. Either the voice in the dark was friend or it was enemy. For the soldiers, the test became symbolic of war's most brutal truth. In the quest to preserve life, they had to trust words more than faces, accents more than hearts, and sometimes even the right word came too late. Infiltration warfare fed directly on human fear, and fear once seated spread faster than disease. Commanders on Guadalcanal noticed it early. Even seasoned troops grew jittery after multiple false alarms. A misplaced twig snap could send a line of sentries firing into the darkness. This constant tension reshaped the psychology of every soldier on night duty. Men described the hours before dawn as the longest eternity. Every whisper, every gust of wind, every word spoken in English carried an undercurrent of doubt. The Japanese exploited this mercilessly. Even when infiltration attempts failed, the psychological damage lingered. Soldiers started doubting their own hearing. Did he say it right, or did I imagine the slip? Paranoia fractured the calm required for effective command. The U.S. Army recognized this mental strain and began integrating routine drills to rebuild confidence. Troops were trained to pronounce passwords clearly, even under exhaustion. Sentries were paired in twos so that judgment never rested on a single man's nerves. But no amount of training erased the instinctive fear that the enemy could sound exactly like you. For the Japanese infiltrators, the psychological toll was equally severe. They operated alone or in tiny units, cut off from friendly lines, knowing discovery meant certain death. Their mission demanded flawless composure, to walk into an enemy perimeter wearing their uniform, speaking their language, staring down their guns. Even the bravest among them faced the crushing pressure of knowing that a single mispronounced L could end their life. Both sides, in different ways, waged war against their own humanity. The Americans learned distrust. The Japanese learned silence. The battlefield was no longer just physical terrain. It was psychological terrain, mined with suspicion and fear. And in that invisible struggle, the simple word Lollapalooza became a symbol of survival, not because it was clever, but because it reminded soldiers that even the human voice could not be trusted. When Allied intelligence later examined the infiltration tactics of the Japanese army, they realized how sophisticated the operations had become. Infiltration wasn't improvisation, it was doctrine. Japanese manuals from the early 1940s detailed methods for approaching enemy lines, identifying sentries, and imitating commands. Some infiltrators were trained specifically to exploit confusion after bombardments. They would enter American lines amid the chaos, posing as medics or messengers, to deliver false orders that sent troops moving in the wrong direction. Others focused on sabotage, cutting communication wires, stealing maps, or destroying radio sets before fading back into the jungle. These operations had real consequences. In the early stages of the Guadalcanal campaign, several night attacks succeeded because U.S. units had been fed false signals or delayed by confusion over friendly movement. Commanders soon realized that no system relying purely on visual recognition could work. Language had to become part of the defense itself. Thus, from late 1942 onward, linguistic countermeasures became standardized across the Pacific. Each night's passwords were random, culturally loaded, and deliberately difficult for non-native English speakers to reproduce. The challenge word Lollapalooza was paired with a reply, sometimes lemonade, Ticonderoga, or Kalamazoo. Together, they formed verbal signatures of American identity. By 1944, this doctrine had spread beyond the Pacific. In Europe, similar phonetic tests were used against German infiltrators during the Battle of the Bulge, where English-speaking Germans in U.S. uniforms attempted to penetrate Allied lines. Language had become an integral part of battlefield security, a weapon of sound as effective as steel. Strategically, the lessons of these encounters reshaped Allied intelligence operations. They revealed that the human voice could serve as both code and cipher, flexible, immediate, and nearly impossible to forge without years of immersion. What began as a desperate improvisation in the jungles of Guadalcanal evolved into a cornerstone of modern counterintelligence. As the war deepened and the stakes rose, These methods would be tested to their limits. The turning point came not from a theory or an order, but from one night, one confrontation where the deception nearly worked, and the test of language determined the outcome of an entire battle. Guadalcanal, late 1942. The battle for the island had become a grinding nightmare. Rain fell like artillery, relentless, deafening. Every foot of jungle was contested by men who had long forgotten what dry clothes or sleep felt like. The Americans held a fragile perimeter around Henderson Field, the airstrip that symbolized control of the island. At night, Japanese forces crept through the trees, silent, precise, patient. The front lines were invisible, made of shadows and nerves rather than trenches. On one such night, a group of Japanese soldiers from the 17th Army attempted an infiltration that would later become the most studied deception attempt of the Pacific Campaign. Their mission: slip through American lines disguised as a returning Marine patrol and sabotage the radio post controlling air operations. The plan was meticulous. The infiltrators wore scavenged U.S. uniforms stripped from the dead, complete with rank insignia and dog tags. They carried American rifles captured from earlier skirmishes, and crucially, 2 among them had trained for months in English, practicing American slang and unit phrases learned from prisoners and intercepted communications. Shortly after midnight, they approached the outer defensive ring. A pair of U.S. Marines, exhausted and half-soaked, stood guard along a muddy track leading toward the command post. They could hear faint voices approaching, English words confident and clear. Patrol from Company E returning from the river. The lead Marine squinted through the darkness. The men approaching looked right, uniforms, helmets, even posture. He hesitated, then remembered his orders. No one passes without the challenge. He raised his rifle. Password. The answer came instantly, the wrong one. They had used the previous night's word. A tense silence followed. The lead infiltrator quickly corrected himself, saying the current code which they had apparently overheard from a distant exchange earlier in the evening. But that wasn't enough. The challenge word remained. The Marine called out Lollapalooza. The infiltrators froze. For the first time, their composure cracked. It wasn't the meaning that trapped them, and it was the sound. Their leader tried to repeat it. Rorabaruza. The L dissolved into R, the syllables tangled. In that heartbeat of hesitation, both sides understood what was about to happen. Gunfire erupted. Muzzle flashes tore through the rain. Within seconds, the night was chaos. Shouts, screams, the thud of bodies hitting mud. When it was over, the path was strewn with uniforms that in the dark still looked American. The infiltration had failed. But it revealed something far more valuable: how deeply the enemy had studied the Americans and how fragile human perception could be under pressure. At dawn, officers examined the bodies. They found maps of Henderson Field, rough sketches of supply routes, and notes written in Roman letters, phonetic approximations of English passwords and slang. It was proof that Japanese intelligence had been systematically gathering linguistic data from every possible source. This single encounter sent shockwaves through the command structure. Reports reached Washington describing how enemy agents had nearly breached a command post by language alone. Military linguists were immediately called to refine the system further. That night and every night after, the challenge words grew harder. Lollapalooza became legend, the password that saved a perimeter. It proved that the enemy's imitation, no matter how convincing, could be undone by the smallest sound. But even as soldiers laughed about it later, calling it the funniest word in the war, none forgot the sight of their fallen comrades. The word may have been whimsical, but its purpose was deadly serious. For the Americans, it restored a kind of faith that they could still outthink an enemy who had, for months, seemed unstoppable. For the Japanese, it marked the beginning of the end for their infiltration tactics. And yet beneath this tactical triumph lay a deeper unease. Because if words could expose an enemy, they could also betray a friend. Every mispronunciation, every tired mumble, could still spark a tragedy. The war had reached a new phase, one where silence and speech held equal power, and trust itself had become a weapon. Southwest Pacific, December 1942. After the failed infiltration on Guadalcanal, a new tension gripped the Allied lines. Every whisper, every shadow, every unfamiliar accent was now treated with suspicion. The Pacific had become not only a battlefield of bullets, but of voices. American command began studying the psychology of recognition under stress. They learned that even trained soldiers could mistake a friend for an enemy when exhausted or afraid. So they devised a brutal experiment, a mock infiltration exercise across several outposts, where Marine units would attempt to trick their own comrades using imitation to find out just how fragile their systems were. What they discovered was terrifying. Out of 18 attempts, 7 succeeded. 7 times a sentry had allowed a friendly patrol through, because the voice or the uniform or the confidence simply felt right. Language wasn't enough. They needed something deeper. Something no spy, no infiltrator could fake under pressure. That's when the idea of coded pronunciation was born. Each night, a password was still issued, but soldiers were now given a guide on how to say it, a hidden cue known only to friendly forces. For instance, a word might be spoken with deliberate stress on a wrong syllable, a signal invisible to the enemy. To anyone else, it would sound like an accent or a slip of the tongue. To the right ear, it meant safety. The experiment worked, and within weeks, American outposts were teaching a crude form of phonetic code, spoken deception used against deceivers. But the Japanese were evolving too. Intelligence from captured prisoners revealed that Tokyo had ordered its forward units to recruit bilingual soldiers, men raised or educated abroad before the war. The aim, to rebuild their infiltration program with authentic American voices, and so began what historians now call the War of Mimicry. One such attempt came at the height of the Battle of Buna in Papua New Guinea. The Japanese held the jungles, the Allies held the beachheads, and between them stretched a nightmare of mud, disease, and hidden snipers. On a foggy dawn, a group of Australian soldiers reported hearing a voice shouting, "Cease fire! Friendly patrol coming through." The words were perfect. The accent almost native, but the radio operators hadn't been told of any friendly patrols in that sector. The Australians hesitated, guns raised. Then they noticed something odd. The voice, and though fluent, carried a rhythm that didn't quite fit. It was too careful, like someone reciting from memory, not speaking naturally. A burst of machine gun fire answered the doubt. When the fog cleared, the infiltrators lay dead, their pockets full of hand-drawn sketches and a few English dictionaries marked with phonetic notes. The Australians had survived by trusting instinct over language. But this time there was no laughter. The war had turned eerie. Voices of friends could no longer be trusted, and silence had become the only true ally. Across the Pacific, these encounters began to shape new doctrine. The U.S. Navy changed its communication systems, adopting unique authentication codes that required not just the right words, but the right timing between words. Pauses, rhythm, stress. The music of speech itself became part of warfare. This idea, that human speech could carry secret signatures, would later evolve into what modern intelligence calls voice authentication. But back then it was pure desperation, men dying in the mud, trying to ensure they didn't die by the voice of a friend. Still, despite every safeguard, mistakes happened. In January 1943, during the fight for Mount Austin on Guadalcanal, an American unit accidentally fired on their own reinforcements after a misheard challenge. The password had been blackjack. But over the rain and chaos, one soldier shouted it as backjack. It was enough to trigger a firefight that lasted nearly 10 minutes. When the truth emerged, silence fell across the ridge. No one spoke for hours. The survivors buried their dead, knowing the enemy hadn't even been there. The war had stripped away the certainty of identity itself. Friend or foe, it no longer depended on what you wore or carried, but how you spoke, how you paused, how human you sounded when fear gripped your throat. These small details, meaningless in peace, became the difference between life and death. In a war defined by massive fleets, air raids, and industrial destruction, it was now the tremor in a man's voice that decided who lived through the night. The Pacific had changed forever. Words had become weapons, and the soldiers trapped between them had learned that the deadliest deception wasn't a bullet in the dark. It was the sound of someone saying, "It's me, don't shoot." By mid-1943, the infiltration threat had reached its peak. The Pacific war lines, from New Guinea to Tarawa, pulsed with suspicion. And the Allies, learning fast, began turning that paranoia into precision. Every base now had a daily password, a secondary challenge, and a tertiary phrase used in emergencies. At night, sentries didn't just listen, they studied. The slight hesitation before a vowel, the stress on the wrong syllable, even how fast a man replied. The idea was simple. Real soldiers were exhausted, distracted, human. Imposters sounded too perfect. Soon a quiet evolution began within the Allied forces, a linguistic awakening born from war. Intelligence officers brought in linguists, professors, and actors to train troops in speech recognition. They taught Marines to notice tone and inflection the way snipers studied wind and distance. The term Lollapalooza Test, once just a funny password, became a symbol of this awakening. It reminded soldiers that the absurd could save lives, that the most American-sounding thing might be the hardest word for an infiltrator to pronounce. It wasn't just about catching spies anymore. It became a psychological contest, each side trying to anticipate how the other thought. When U.S. codebreakers in Hawaii intercepted Japanese communications in mid-1943, they discovered something chilling. The Japanese were conducting their own reverse training, mimicking American slang, studying captured radio transcripts, even listening to intercepted broadcasts to perfect their tone. Some infiltrators practiced by reading Time magazine aloud, line by line for hours. But language is never just words. It's rhythm, emotion, culture, the unteachable fingerprints of speech. That was what always betrayed them. One captured Japanese operative later admitted under interrogation that he and his comrades practiced the word okay for days, but could never make it sound casual. It came out flat, careful, too deliberate. The Americans, meanwhile, said it without thought, lazy, fast, with a rise at the end. That difference, invisible on paper, had meant survival. Infiltration units began to fade from Japanese strategy after 1943. The tactic that once terrified Allied lines became too costly and unreliable. The English-speaking soldiers they trained, often former students or diplomats, were too few to replace the dead. And every failed attempt now ended not just in death, but in valuable intelligence falling into American hands. By late 1943, the U.S. had even begun counter-infiltrations, operations designed to confuse Japanese scouts by broadcasting misleading shouts or mimicked accents during night battles. Marines would sometimes yell in Japanese to disorient attackers. It wasn't mockery, it was survival by sound. This strange evolution went where language itself became a battlefield, marked one of the Pacific War's most overlooked fronts. A silent duel fought through speech and suspicion, and though the famous Lollapalooza checkpoint on Guadalcanal had begun as an accident of improvisation, it rippled through every front-line command. Within a year, similar verbal challenge systems were standard across Allied forces, from the British in Burma to the U.S. Army in the Philippines. Even the Soviets, though fighting half a world away, began adopting their own phonetic passwords after hearing reports from their American allies. The infiltration threat wasn't gone, but it had transformed. No longer a game of deception, it had become a lesson in humanity, because what the soldiers realized, standing guard through endless nights of rain and fear, was that the human voice, with all its imperfections, was the ultimate proof of life. No code or uniform could ever replace that. When the Marines advanced across the Pacific in 1944, through Tarawa, Kwajalein, Saipan, the word checks followed them like a ghost from Guadalcanal. In some accounts, soldiers still used absurd words: Lollapalooza, Saskatchewan, Tallahassee. The harder they were to say, the better they worked. Each time a challenge was given and answered correctly, a small sigh of relief passed between the men, not because of protocol, but because they knew the voice was real. By the time U.S. troops reached the Philippines, the infiltration war had faded into memory, but its legacy lived on, reshaping how militaries would think about communication forever. Because in the end, the war of mimicry had proved one thing above all: technology could fail. Radios could break, codes could be stolen, but language, human speech, carried something machines never could: identity. That realization would later inspire advancements in voice print technology during the Cold War, Systems, designed to recognize a speaker not by what they said, but how they said it. All of it traced back in one way or another to that night on Guadalcanal, when a single strange word, Lollapalooza, exposed a hidden enemy and taught the world the power of a voice. When the infiltration threat finally began to fade in 1944, it didn't disappear quietly. The Pacific Front had been reshaped by it, not just tactically but psychologically. For the men on the ground, trust had become fragile. Every patrol that returned at night was greeted with rifles half raised, questions sharp and brief. Password? Lollapalooza. The word that once caused laughter now felt heavy, a barrier between life and death. Commanders noticed it in their reports. Morale was high when victories came, but suspicion lingered like a ghost in the ranks. Sentries were sleeping less. Soldiers flinched at unexpected voices, and the line between friend and foe had blurred in their minds. Military psychologists later called it linguistic paranoia, a deep-rooted distrust of communication itself. On Guadalcanal, on Tarawa, on Bougainville, veterans recalled that even months after the infiltration attempts stopped, they still tested each other unconsciously. A joke, a phrase, a hesitation. It was enough to trigger instinctive tension. And yet beneath that paranoia was pride. Because those same men knew they had helped defeat one of the most insidious weapons of the war: deception by language. Official records from the U.S. Marine Corps show that by early 1944, infiltration casualties had dropped by nearly 90%. Only scattered attempts continued in the Philippines and New Guinea, most of them detected within minutes. The once deadly tactic that nearly broke Allied defenses had been turned inside out, studied and neutralized through discipline and adaptation. But the lessons didn't end on the battlefield. They spread upward into the halls of intelligence and the codes of the future. The Office of Naval Intelligence began compiling what it called voice recognition reports, detailed analyses of how soldiers identified or misidentified friend and foe by speech. These reports, later declassified, reveal how American linguists cataloged hundreds of field incidents, breaking down stress patterns, vowel lengths, even emotional tone. It was the birth of a new science, phonetic profiling. The reports concluded something profound. Language, they wrote, was not only a medium of communication, it was a fingerprint of culture, memory, and emotion. No infiltrator could truly copy that, no matter how perfect his accent. That realization changed how intelligence officers thought about identity. From then on, every Allied force, American, British, Australian, trained its troops not just to speak, but to listen. A soldier's ear became as important as his rifle. Meanwhile, Japan, facing mounting losses, quietly abandoned infiltration as an organized tactic by the end of 1943. The recruits trained in English, many of whom had studied abroad, were redeployed to propaganda, translation, and radio monitoring units. Tokyo had realized that deception through speech, while ingenious in theory, was unsustainable in the chaos of jungle warfare. But even as strategy shifted, the damage was already done, not to armies but to individuals. For many soldiers, the war had taught them a strange kind of loneliness. The knowledge that even a friendly voice could not always be trusted. Years later, veterans would describe the silence after each night patrol, how no one spoke until dawn, because no one wanted to be mistaken in the dark. The gunfire had stopped, but the caution remained. That was the true aftermath of the Lollapalooza Test. It had saved lives, yes. But it had also revealed a truth about war itself, that trust once broken never fully returns. And yet, in that harsh lesson, lay the foundation of modern communication security. What began as a desperate jungle password became a cornerstone of future military doctrine, one that would echo through the coming decades of Cold War intelligence. In the years that followed the Pacific War, the lessons of the Lollapalooza Test rippled far beyond the islands where it began. What started as a desperate trick of fieldcraft had exposed a hidden frontier of warfare, the human voice itself. By 1945, American and British intelligence agencies had begun formal studies into speech recognition under stress. The findings shaped the next generation of military communication and, eventually, modern intelligence work. One of the earliest outcomes came from the Office of Strategic Services, OSS, the wartime forerunner of the CIA. Analysts there began experimenting with early sound spectrographs to study voice patterns. They discovered that every person's speech carried unique markers: pitch contour, resonance, vowel spread, all shaped by their physiology and background. What had once been anecdotal, a soldier recognizing a comrade by tone, was now measurable science. By the 1950s, that research evolved into the first practical concept of voice-print identification. Intelligence agencies realized they could identify spies and defectors by their recorded speech, a direct descendant of the wartime challenge system. It was, in essence, the Lollapalooza Test reimagined by machines, but for the soldiers who lived it, the memory wasn't technological. It was human, a mix of fear, humor, and survival. Veterans' interviews decades later still mentioned the absurd password. They spoke of how laughter sometimes followed the word, even amid gunfire, because it reminded them they were still alive. A Marine named Corporal Thomas Hale, who served on Guadalcanal, once said in an oral history interview, "That word saved us. Lollapalooza. None of us even knew what it meant. But when someone said it right, you could feel the tension drop. You knew it was one of your own. For others, it symbolized the unpredictability of war, how something so small, so strange, could determine fate." In Japan, meanwhile, the infiltration efforts became a somber footnote in military archives. Post-war Japanese historians would later describe them as tactics of desperation, ingenious but doomed by cultural distance. Few of the infiltrators ever returned. Their failure underscored a painful truth: that war fought across languages was not just about translation, but about identity itself. The U.S. military, however, never forgot. Throughout the Cold War, verbal authentication systems remained a cornerstone of security. From radio check-ins in Korea to nuclear command verification protocols. Even as encryption and electronics advanced, one layer never disappeared: the human voice. Every challenge word, every countersign, every confirmation spoken over a secure line traced its ancestry to the mud of Guadalcanal, to a sergeant holding his rifle in the rain, listening for a word that sounded almost right but wasn't. In time, linguists and historians began to look back at the Lollapalooza story not just as a tactical episode, but as a metaphor, proof that the smallest fragments of culture could become instruments of survival. It was an accidental lesson in anthropology born from chaos, and in that sense, the war had come full circle. The same global conflict that had shattered nations had also reminded humanity of what connects them: the fragile, distinct, irreplaceable sound of a voice. Today, military academies and intelligence schools still reference the Lollapalooza incident when teaching verbal recognition protocols. It stands as both a case study and a parable. That technology may change, codes may evolve, but in the end, trust is always personal. It lives in tone, timing, and instinct, the things no algorithm can yet replicate. So while the Pacific Islands have grown quiet, and the jungle has reclaimed the battlefields, one legacy endures. The word that once unmasked death in the dark has become a symbol of awareness, a reminder that even in the machinery of war, humanity whispers through. War often teaches through destruction. It strips away illusions, leaving behind truths that are raw, unsettling, and permanent. The story of the Lollapalooza Test is one of those truths, born not from strategy or brilliance, but from fear, instinct, and the fragile trust between men in darkness. It began as a simple challenge, a word chosen almost by chance, yet it revealed something extraordinary: that even in the most mechanical machinery of war, humanity is still the decisive factor. No infiltration plan, no disguise, no script of perfect English could replace the real weight of a human voice. A tremor, a hesitation, a misplaced syllable. These tiny imperfections became lifelines. They reminded the soldiers on those rain-soaked trails that identity isn't carried in uniforms or passwords. It's carried in the rhythm of speech, in the unguarded sound of being alive. As decades passed, warfare grew colder, more distant, fought with signals, drones, and data. But the essence of that lesson remained. Every code, every authentication, every system of recognition still traces back to that primal moment in the jungle. One man asking another to prove he was real. The absurd word, Lollapalooza, has long faded from military protocol, but not from memory. It lives as a symbol of vigilance and humanity intertwined, of how in the chaos of war the smallest fragments of culture, even a funny, tongue-twisting word could draw the line between life and death. In the end, the Lollapalooza checkpoint wasn't just a story about deception. It was a reminder of what war truly reveals, that trust once lost is never easily rebuilt, but also that courage often hides in the most human acts of discernment, listening, speaking, and believing the sound of truth when you hear it. The Pacific War ended long ago, but the echo of that night still lingers, in every soldier who waits for a password in the dark, in every intelligence officer who studies a voice for authenticity, and in every reminder that behind every code, there is still a person, trying somehow to be recognized.